October 14th, 1887, the Dakota Territory. The sky was a bruised shade of purple, the kind that hangs low and heavy over the prairie just before the sun dips below the horizon. The wind was already picking up, carrying that distinct, metallic scent of frost that every frontiersman learns to fear. But on Silas Vance's claim, the air smelled different. It didn't smell like snow. It smelled like smoke. Thick, black, choking smoke. Silas stood in the center of his unfinished cabin, his face smeared with soot, his hands blistered, while his neighbors were frantically rushing to cut sod bricks from the creek bed to finish their roofs before the first freeze. Silas was doing something that looked, to the untrained eye, like absolute madness. He was burning his own lumber. He had taken perfectly good hardwood log timber that had cost him weeks of back-breaking labor to haul from the river bottoms, and he had set them on fire in a pit, smothering the flames with dirt just before they turned to ash. He wasn't making firewood, he was making charcoal, huge, jagged chunks of blackened, carbonized wood. Look at him, a voice drifted over the property line. It was Lars Jensen, a hulking Swede who had settled the adjacent claim 3 months prior. Lars was a good man, strong as an ox, but he was a traditionalist. He built things the way his grandfather had built them in the old country. Vance has finally lost his mind. Winter is breathing down our necks, and he is burning his building materials. A small group of settlers had gathered near Lars's wagon, watching the spectacle. They chuckled, shaking their heads. To them, survival was a simple equation. Thick walls equaled warmth. They were stacking sod-thick ribbons of earth held together by prairie grass roots layer upon layer. It was heavy, it was wet, and it was the way things were done. Silas ignored them. He shoveled the cooled, crushed charcoal into buckets. He climbed his ladder and began spreading the black debris across the ceiling boards of his cabin, creating a layer 6 inches deep. It looked like he was insulating his home with garbage. "Hey Vance," Lars shouted, his voice thick with mockery. "You're planning to live in a chimney. That soot is going to sift down into your stew." The group laughed. It was a nervous laughter, the kind born of the deep-seated anxiety that comes with a high plains winter. They needed a release, and the crazy engineer next door was an easy target. Silas paused, leaning on his shovel. He looked at Lars, then up at the graying sky. "Earth holds water, Lars," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying in the wind. "Water freezes, and ice doesn't stop the cold, it invites it in." Lars waved him off, turning back to his own roof. "Dirt is dirt, Vance. It's kept men warm for 1,000 years. Don't come knocking when you freeze to death under that pile of burnt trash." They laughed. They laughed because they didn't understand the invisible war Silas was preparing to fight. They saw a man wasting resources. Silas saw the laws of thermodynamics, and he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that when the great die-up came, laughter wouldn't keep anyone warm. To understand why Silas Vance was betting his life on burnt wood, you have to understand who he was before he came west. Silas wasn't a farmer by trade. He hadn't spent his youth behind a plow. 10 years earlier, he had been a foreman at a smelting operation in Pennsylvania. He had spent a decade staring into blast furnaces. He understood heat not as a vague concept of comfort, but as a fluid of physical force that moved, transferred, and escaped. He knew that in a smelter, you didn't line the furnaces with solid stone or wet clay, because the heat would transfer right through it. You lined them with carbon. You lined them with materials that had air gaps. Silas knew the secret that the sodbusters missed. Conduction. The standard sod roof was a death trap in disguise. Sod is soil and grass. It holds moisture. In the summer, that moisture evaporates and cools the house a blessing. But in the winter, that moisture is the enemy. When the temperature drops to 20 below, the water inside the sod freezes. The roof essentially becomes a solid block of ice, weighing tons, sitting directly on top of the timber rafters. Ice is a conductor. It pulls heat out of a room faster than dry air. Silas knew that if he piled sod directly onto his ceiling boards, the heat from his stove would rise, hit the cold ceiling, and be sucked out into the frozen night. Worse, the meeting of hot air and a freezing roof would create condensation. It would rain inside the cabin. So, he engineered a thermal break. The charcoal layer was his masterstroke. Charcoal is wood that has had all the water and volatile gases burned out of it. What remains is a carbon skeleton or honeycomb structure of microscopic pores. Millions of tiny pockets of dead air. In the world of physics, still air is one of the best insulators in existence. Heat struggles to move through air pockets. By crushing the charcoal and laying it 6 inches thick, Silas wasn't building a dirt roof. He was building a primitive version of modern fiberglass insulation. He would put the sod on top of the charcoal to stop the wind and add weight, but the charcoal would act as the gatekeeper. It would force the heat to stay inside. The neighbors saw trash. Silas saw Arvali. If you enjoy uncovering these lost survival technologies and the history behind them, make sure to subscribe. We dig deep into the archives to find the engineering secrets that kept our ancestors alive when the odds were zero. The test didn't come gently. It arrived with the violence of a freight train on January 12, 1888. History remembers it as the Schoolhouse Blizzard or the Children's Blizzard, but on the high plains, they simply called it the White Death. The morning had started deceptively mild, almost warm, luring settlers out of their cabins to tend stock or travel to town. Silas stayed put. He had watched the barometer on his Waller-prized possession from his mining days drop so fast he thought the glass had cracked. At 3 p.m., the wall of white hit. The temperature plummeted. It didn't just slide, it crashed. In the span of 4 hours, the mercury fell from a balmy 30 degrees above zero to 20 degrees below. The wind howled at 60 miles per hour, driving snow crystals so fine they penetrated keyholes and cracks in the walls like dust. Over at the Jensen claim, the situation deteriorated from uncomfortable to life-threatening in less than an hour. Lars Jensen had built a sturdy cabin. His walls were 2 feet thick. His roof was 18 inches of prime, grass-side-down sod. But as the temperature outside screamed toward -30, physics began to take its toll. Inside Lars's cabin, the family huddled around the Castian stove. They were feeding it corn cobs and wood as fast as they could, until the metal glowed cherry red. But it didn't matter. I can see my breath, Lars's wife whispered, pulling a quilt tighter around their youngest daughter. She was sitting 5 feet from the roaring stove. Lars looked up at the ceiling and cursed. The sod roof, saturated from the autumn rains, had frozen solid. It was a massive, conductive heat sink. The heat from the stove rose, hit the ceiling, and was instantly transferred through the frozen earth to the screaming wind outside. It created a convection current of misery. The air near the stove was hot, but as soon as it moved, it hit the ice block roof, cooled instantly, and fell back down on their heads as a freezing draft. Then, the weeping started. Not the children, the roof. The heat from the stove was just enough to melt the bottom millimeter of the frozen sod. Dirty, freezing slush began to drip from the ceiling boards. It hissed as it hit the hot stove. It dripped onto the bedding, it dripped onto the table. Lars scrambled to hang oilcloths, but the dampness was pervasive. The humidity in the cabin skyrocketed, and because the walls were freezing, that humidity turned into frost. The inside of the cabin began to turn white. They were sitting inside a freezer, burning their winter fuel supply at a reckless pace, yet the thermometer on the wall read 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Lars looked at his wife. Her lips were blue, the woodpile was shrinking, and the storm showed no sign of stopping. 300 yards away, the scene inside Silas Vance's cabin was surreal in its normalcy. Silas sat in his rocking chair, reading a mesmerizing article in an old almanac. His wife Martha was kneading dough on the table. She wasn't wearing a coat, she was wearing a shawl, more out of habit than necessity. The wind outside sounded like a demon trying to tear the door off its hinges. The noise was deafening, a constant high-pitched shriek that vibrated the floorboards, but inside the air was still dry warm. Silas glanced at the thermometer hanging by the window, 64 degrees. He walked to the stove. He threw in a single log, just one. He wouldn't need another for 2 hours. He looked up at the ceiling. It was dry as a bone. The physics were working perfectly. The heat rose from the stove and hit the ceiling boards. But instead of slamming into a block of frozen sod, it hit the layer of charcoal. The heat energy tried to push through, but it was trapped in the millions of tiny air pockets within the carbon. It couldn't conduct, blocked from escaping. The heat had nowhere to go but back down into the room. The charcoal layer had reached an equilibrium. It was warm to the touch. The sod roof above it was frozen solid, battling the blizzard, but the charcoal acted as a demilitarized zone. The war between the heat and the cold was happening inside the roof, not inside the room. Silas poured a cup of coffee. It stayed hot. The next morning, the winds died down, though the cold remained brutal, -35 degrees. The silence of the prairie was heavy. Silas opened his door, pushing against a 4-foot drift. The light was blinding. He shoveled a path and looked toward Lars's cabin. No smoke was coming from the chimney. Fear, cold and sharp, spiked in Silas's chest. He grabbed his shovel and a flask of whiskey and waded through the snow toward his neighbor's claim. He found Lars frantically trying to clear the snow from his door. The big Swede looked like a ghost. His skin was gray, his eyes hollow, and his eyebrows were caked in ice. "Lars!" Silas shouted. Lars looked up, shivering so violently he could barely stand. "The stove," he stammered, his teeth chattering like dice in a cup. It won't keep up. We're freezing. Vance, the roof. It's dripping ice. Get them out, Silas commanded. Bring them to my place. Now. 10 minutes later, the Jensen family stumbled through Silas's door. The reaction was immediate. As Lars crossed the threshold, he stopped dead. He didn't just feel the warmth. He walked into it like a wall. It wasn't the searing, localized heat of a stove fighting a draft. It was an ambient, enveloping warmth. Lars pulled the hat off his head. He looked at the stove. It wasn't even glowing red. He looked at the wood box. It was still full. Then he looked up at the ceiling. No drips, no frost, no ice. Lars slumped into a chair, the exhaustion finally overtaking him. He looked at Silas, then back at the ceiling. The same ceiling he had mocked. The burnt trash roof. How? Lars whispered, his voice cracking. How is it so warm? You have half the fire I do. Silas handed him the coffee. I didn't try to heat the prairie, Lars, I just kept the heat I made. Let's stop the story for a moment and break down the hard math of why this worked. Because this isn't just a frontier tall tale, it is a lesson in thermodynamics that applies to every modern home today. The failure of Lars's cabin and the success of Silas's cabin comes down to a metric we use in engineering called AR value, or thermal resistance. This measures how well a material resists the flow of heat. Lars's roof was frozen sod. Soil is a thermal mass. It has a high thermal capacity, it can hold heat, but a very low thermal resistance. When soil is wet and frozen, its R value is approximately 0.25 per inch. Lars had 18 inches of sod. Total R value 4.5. That is remarkably low. For context, a modern house roof typically requires an R value of R49 to R60, with an R value of 4.5. Lars was essentially trying to heat his cabin with the windows open. The thermal bridging was catastrophic. The heat energy moved through the frozen dirt almost as fast as the stove could produce it. Now, look at Silas's charcoal gap system. Charcoal is highly porous. It is essentially carbonized foam. While precise historical measurements vary, loose fill charcoal has an R value closer to 3.0 per inch when packed correctly with air gaps. Silas had 6 inches of charcoal, plus the sod on top. Charcoal layer, 6 inches x 3.0 equals R18. Sod layer, R4.5. Total R value, 22.5. He only needed about 12,000 BTUs per hour to maintain the same temperature. He burned 75% less wood. While Lars was exhausting himself fighting the cold, Silas was letting the physics do the work. The burnt roof wasn't trash. It was a high-efficiency insulation envelope. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally broke, the landscape was changed. Cattle lay frozen in the fields. Some settlers, those with thin walls and poor wood supplies, didn't wake up, but the Jensens survived, huddled on the floor of Silas Vance's cabin. When spring finally broke the hold of winter in April, the sound of construction filled the air again, but this time, there was no laughter. Lars Jensen was the first one up on his roof. He took a pickaxe to the sod he had so carefully laid the previous autumn. He tore it all down, muddy block by muddy block, until his rafters were bare. Then, he started a fire. He dug a pit, filled it with his best timber, and began the process of making charcoal. One by one, the other neighbors followed suit. The Vance method spread throughout the settlement. By the following winter, you could tell which settlers had learned their lesson by the black dust that coated their hands and the distinctive dark layer sandwiched between their ceiling boards. Silas Vance didn't invent insulation. He simply remembered a principle that nature has always known. Survival isn't about brute force. It isn't about how much wood you can chop or how thick you can stack the dirt. Survival is about adaptation. Today we use rock wool, fiberglass, and spray foam. We wrap our houses in Tyvek and worry about thermal envelopes. We give it fancy names and code requirements. But in 1888, on a frozen, windswept plain, it was just a man, a pile of burnt logs, and the knowledge that sometimes the thing everyone laughs at is the only thing that will save you. The frontier didn't reward tradition, it rewarded what worked. Stay warm, and I'll see you in the next one.